The last thing that the counterculture did for me was that when I was in college, I started taking classes in contemporary literature, and I began studying postmodernism. What I saw in postmodern fiction, in people like Brodigan and Vonnegut, Borges, Nabokov, John Barth, who became my teacher, and Donald Barthelme, what I saw in them was John Lennon's ironic, rule-breaking spirit. And so what I thought was, well, this is, of course, the kind of book, the kind of novel that the hippies who have raised and loved me would read. This is the literature of the counterculture, and that's how I really got into it. It wasn't anything like a kind of elite literary East Coast culture, this wave of enthusiasm for the experimental or the innovative. It was to me very sort of intimate and local. So these three things together were my ideology when I was young. They were the things that I thought were natural. They were the of course of my life, as ridiculous as that is, or sounds now. Of course I grew up in a suburb. Didn't everybody? Of course I went to college. Doesn't everybody? Of course I love the hippies and the counterculture. Doesn't everybody? But, you know, it was just natural to me. So now we move to part two. It's really just been in the last few years. Do you guys want to watch this while I'm talking about the rest of this stuff? Probably not. She's cute, but she's not actually my mother. You understand that. That I've begun to understand that, you know, how I became who I am doesn't end with simply being an aging hippie. It doesn't end with, well, I am the way I am because I was a baby boomer, or because I was a hippie, or because I was a postmodernist, or because I was a child of the Cold War. So what I did basically was pull on the rope again, and I saw something else moving beyond the horizon, even beyond. I mean, it was hard enough sort of to get a grip on how those social forces of the 50s, 60s, how those shaped me. But now to imagine that there was something well beyond that was deeply intriguing to me. And what that thing was that I found beyond the horizon was Romanticism. Romanticism, in my mind, is not a brief period in art history, and it's not about a mostly addled, I suppose, mystical affection for the world of nature and the spirit world to be found there. Romanticism was really the culture of the entire 19th century, and if it was the culture of the 19th century, it was surely also the culture of the 20th century, and in my mind, it is the best hope for the culture of the 21st century. Romanticism is actually, I think, a very unfortunate name for that kind of constellation of art, philosophy, and social action. It is deeply misleading, I think. It tends to make Romanticism seem as if it were simply about some sort of a naive affection for Middle Age, tales of the Middle Ages. At its nearest kin, German idealism isn't really a much more useful kind of title. In my mind, the thing that Romanticism ought to be called is again from Nietzsche, who, for a critic, Morse Peckham, that I'm very dependent upon for many of the ideas I'll be presenting. Nietzsche was the triumph of Romanticism. Who thinks of Nietzsche as being a romantic? But he really was. He was part of that tradition. And what Nietzsche argued, I mean, his great value was what he called the great yea to life. And in my mind, that's what Romanticism is. Romanticism was a great yea to life, and a sort of self-conscious awareness of what that meant, exactly what the forces aligned against life were. So what I want to present you with is the idea that Romanticism is not some touchy-feely thing, that goes back to Jakob Boehm or forward to New Agey stuff. It is a pattern or logic, and yeah. So I thought I would use this. So this I think are the rudiments of what we could call the pattern of romantic dialectic. So we begin with the assumption of a power, with positing a power, which is in most cases something vaguely called nature. In Schopenhauer it was called will. In Freud it was called the id. In Marx it was called humanity. But there's the idea that there's the enormous power out there, a force that has something to do with nature, but most importantly for the Romantics, I think it meant human nature. Even Wordsworth, in the Prelude, makes it very clear that human nature is superior to, is more important than nature, even though obviously Wordsworth was fond of nature. So the second part of the story is that there's a distortion of this power. Marx, for example, called humanity, he talked about natural children, and that capitalism was a distorting force. It alienated people from their natural condition. So this distortion most of the time takes the form, starting with Rousseau, of an idea of civilization. And then it gets refined in certain ways, as I'll take up in a moment. So we have first this sort of drama of a fundamental power that is distorted in some way, harmed, minimalized, damaged, as Theodor Adorno would put it. Then what the philosophers of Romanticism discovered was that within this distortion was an internal contradiction that would actually save the power from that original distortion. So there is an internal contradiction. And the most famous example of that, I suppose, is Marx's notion of capitalism creating its own gravediggers, right? So the proletariat. But Nietzsche talks about, for example, the internal contradiction in Christianity is that Christianity has a commitment to the truth. It preaches the truth. But of course, the truth, it becomes the tool that destroys in the hands of people like Nietzsche, that destroy the mythology of the church. So, and then the fourth step is a new power is created by the activities and the actions, by the effects of this internal contradiction. And for most of the Romantics, of course, that internal contradiction didn't take the shape of the proletariat, it took the shape of the artist-philosopher. And the ultimate goal was the full realization of what almost all of them called freedom, especially Hegel, but Schiller, who I'll talk about next, called play. I suppose some of you want me to go back and talk about my childhood now. This is so tedious. Can't he go back and talk about himself more? Okay, Friedrich Schiller is, as far as I can tell, outside of a few German departments, really a forgotten man. But his essays, The Aesthetic Education of Man and Naive and Sentimental Poetry, are two of the most mind-blowing essays I've read in years. Schiller posited something he called nature, although he was a Rousseauian, but the nature he was interested in was not Rousseau's nature, going out and living with the shepherds or whatever. The nature he was interested in was human nature. And then the distorting force for him was culture, by which what he really meant was what we would call ideology. In other words, those constricting fictions about how to live that tend to hem us in. The thing that saves us from that culture is he calls it play. Sort of serious play. And one of his examples, those of you who know Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, Stern is actually one of his examples of how art plays and how it actually, what he calls models freedom.